Okay, so now we've pretty much covered up the covered the first industrial age. Let's move on to the second industrial revolution. So the first industrial revolution was about simple machines and simple work for the most part. Even the early textile machines were fairly simple, basically getting some very simple moving parts. The second industrial revolution, and by the way, these are all just historian terms. So it's just we're seeing a constant improvement in machinery and technology and power sources and such. But the second industrial revolution is where historians say, well, we're moving away from the simple and moving to more complex. And we're moving away from just simple factories and now moving into machines that can be used in the home. Uh, Different technologies are going to be used in all sorts of different ways. So it's just something we look at afterwards. Historians bicker over and politicians bicker over probably in the fourth or fifth industrial age today, uh, based on different shifts in technology and power sources and materials that we use. So the first industrial age used steel or iron. It used iron and water wheels, and then eventually coal and steam power and stuff. The second industrial age is going to be powered with electricity and steel and oil, and other things are going to follow suit. Today obviously we have computers and nuclear energy, and solar energy, wind power, all these things. We have all new technologies. We're not there yet. But the second industrial age is going to give us the introduction of electricity. So we're getting more towards the modern world that you know. All right, so the first one, let's talk about electricity and how we make it. Now, usually in class, this is where I'd bring out my demonstration. I actually have a see-through dynamo that you can use in class and pass it around, and if you shake it, it's got a magnet inside of it and it'll generate electricity. Unfortunately, we can't do that so easily through the computer here, but I'll try my best to explain the general idea. uh, People have known about electricity for a long time. We didn't really understand it. You had all sorts of different cultural sayings about Zeus or Thor or something like that. People knew what electricity was, but we didn't really understand how to generate it, at least not efficiently, and we didn't know how to use it for anything. Well, that's going to start changing. Um, you've probably heard of Ben Franklin and stuff. He worked with electricity. This is all, that was all pre this. During the early industrial age, though, around 1831, a dynamo was created. A dynamo takes mechanical energy. This is a hand crank version, but of course you can hook that to a water wheel. You can hook that to a steam power generator or whatever. You get something that can spin this wheel, and then this wheel through this belt will spin this over here. Now you've probably you see this N and this S. This is magnets. This is moving copper wire, but basically you just move copper wire and magnets. You could spin the magnet surrounded by copper wire, whatever, and you have an alternating electrical field. I don't understand all the science bits about it. You'd have to ask your science teachers for it. But that alternating current, basically that alternating field there, will create an electrical current. So you can actually generate electricity. Once again, I'm not a science teacher. I don't know all the engineer. I'm not the expert on this stuff. I just know the theory behind it. So a dynamo takes mechanical energy, movement essentially. Your hand movement, that's mechanical, or water wheel or whatever. It takes mechanical energy and transforms it into electrical energy. So now we have an ability to create electricity, and in a pretty stable rate. You hook this onto a river or whatever, and it's going to keep going forever. And so you can produce an amount of electricity that's predictable and easy to generate. We could never do this before. This is groundbreaking. Now we have the ability to have electricity. So this is going to inspire a lot of early inventors. By the 1870s, we start to see electric motors come out. Electric motors basically work with magnets, turning the magnets on and off to spin something. I don't even know. That's beyond me. But it uses magnets to create spinning inside of a tube, like a brushless motor or something. They probably had brushes in the first one. Not important. But basically, they're using electric motors now to create mechanical movement. If you can use electricity then to make movement, to make a motor source, you basically don't need coal right here anymore. As long as you can transmit electricity, which is a miraculous miracle thing, as long as you can transmit electricity to wherever you need it to go, you can then use it to power these motors, which can then do mechanical motion somewhere. That's a game changer. Now you can have relatively clean power anywhere. You can have electrical power pretty much anywhere around the world, as long as there's a power source somewhere. Now it still does require power plants. Most of these power plants are going to be powered by coal. They're going to use coal, burning coal, boiling water, creating steam, using that steam to then move a turbine to basically spin a wheel, and that wheel will then spin a dynamo to generate electricity, and that electricity will then be transported, through power lines to wherever it needs to go, whether it's your house or your school or your factory or place of business. There's still going to be pollution. There's still going to be coal being burnt, or natural gas, and eventually later other things later on, uranium. There's still going to be other power sources used, but they're not going to be close to you anymore. Now the power source is far away. You never see it. You never see the pollution. You never see the impact from it. That's a big thing. It's going to make cities a lot cleaner, quieter, a lot safer. So, electrical power, electrical generators, way more powerful than boiling water everywhere. Not as powerful at first. Eventually, though, electrical will start improving with that as well, and we're kind of still dealing with that. Electrical cars are just now starting to come out, really, because gas cars were just more powerful and more efficient for the longest time. But we've seen a lot of growth, and we've seen a lot of changes. So now we have the ability to use electricity. That's going to be a big game changer. Effects of electricity, moving on. You've probably heard of all these things before, and if not, you've definitely used most of them. So effects of electricity. Now we have electrical power. We can use it to move motors, but what else can we do with it, right? So what people, especially Americans, but other people will be involved as well too, will start using electricity and saying, well, what else can we do other than just moving motors and having a cleaner power source, a quieter, safer power source? What else can we do? Well, Samuel Morse, and you've probably heard of Morse code. Samuel Morse comes up with the idea of taking a wire, basically like a power line, a wire, and then running a signal across it, running an electrical signal across it. And you could tap out beeps and dashes and basically change the signal to simple beeps and lack of sound in order to send Morse code across the wire. If somebody is sending those beeps and dashes, those Morse code, essentially what's going to develop, if you're sending that in a systematic way that can be interpreted on the other side by somebody who knows what those beeps and dashes mean, then the dots and dashes, they can translate it, and you can send messages across long distances now instantly, pretty much instantly. That's a game changer for most of human history. If you wanted to send a message from, let's say, New York to San Francisco, Los Angeles, if you wanted to send a message, you would have to send it by Pony Express, by putting a letter and hoping it got there. If you wanted to send a letter across the ocean, you would have to send a letter, give it to a ship captain, hopefully it gets to the other side without sinking, and then eventually your message would be received on the other side. It could take weeks, it could take months in order to get these letters across. Communication was slow. Imagine trying to, operate a military force in India, but you're, the British Empire based in England. You would have no idea what was going on in India. There could have been an uprising, there could have been an attack, and you wouldn't know about it for months, literally months. That's a huge lag in time. The telegraph's going to change all that. With Morse code, you could have one person in New York, one person in San Francisco, you can have one person in England, one person in somewhere in India, and they could send messages instantly. And I do mean like England to India, or even New York to London, because eventually what they're going to do is take these telegraph wires and run them through the ocean. And it seems weird, and that seems bizarre to you today. That's actually how the internet still works. If you've ever been to a website in China, your signal from your computer probably went under the ocean. We have giant underwater telegraph cables, and eventually internet cables, fiber optic cables. We've improved the technology, but there are giant cables that run underneath the oceans and intertwine the continents together and connect us all. And that's how the world's still connected to this day. Samuel Morse code was just kind of the first version of it. We call this communication system the telegraph. It's obviously slow compared to just picking up a phone and talking to somebody or sending an email, but still, for its time, it was way faster. Now it shrunk the world. It brought everybody closer together. And now we can have intercommunication across the entire world. It's a revolution in communication. You may have heard of Alexander Graham Bell before. He is going to work to try to create a better telegraph. So he didn't invent the telegraph. We usually give that to Morse, but he's going to come up with a better version of it. Bell is going to say, hey, if I want to send a signal from one place to another on the telegraph, I need to basically take over that wire that connects from New York to San Francisco, and I'm going to dominate that wire, and only one message, only one signal can go through at a time. He said, well, what if I modulate it? What if I change the frequency of the signal on the wire? So we're getting a little more advanced, a little more complicated with our technology. But what if I change it, the frequency on the wire? Well, what he stumbled into accidentally was a way of communicating not just one signal at a time. not just dots and dashes and whether there's a sound on the signal or not. He's going to be able to send multiple frequencies at a time. Uh, in a way, he's basically accidentally creating a way to transmit the human voice, a more complex signal. And so Alexander Graham Bell kind of accidentally stumbles into it, but he will create. He was trying to create a better telegraph, but what he ended up, the telegraph that could send multiple signals at the same time, he accidentally creates a telephone. So now we can automatically call people and pick up the phone, and as long as you can speak and remember a phone number, the first ones used human operators to connect the calls, but now you can actually call and speak to anybody. You don't need to know a special code. You don't have to have telegraph operators. All those people lost their jobs. But now you can communicate around the world pretty much instantly, which is amazing. That's another big game changer. Marconi experimented with radio frequencies. I don't remember his first name, but he's an Italian inventor. And he experimented with sending radio signals across the ocean. Originally, of course, using Morse code. Eventually, better technology will come out as well too. But this allowed ships in the oceans, to have open communication. If your ship's in trouble, if you're the Titanic and you hit an iceberg, you can call for help almost instantly now. That's a huge, huge change in technology. Instead of having a ship go out across the ocean and just sink, and we wouldn't know about it for months, the ship just never came into harbor. Now you would know about it as soon as the emergency happened. Maybe you'd be able to save some lives. Of course, that's also going to be a big game changer for war. And you've probably heard of Thomas Edison, right? Everybody knows Thomas Edison. And there's a lot of, pros and cons about him as a person. I'm not going to get into that so much right now. But Thomas Edison is usually accredited with creating the light bulb. Yes, he stole a lot of other people's ideas and used their ideas, but credit where credit's due. He was involved with it. He tested thousands of different materials before finally coming up with a material that would work in a light bulb. What he basically did is he did everything: beard, hair, plants, tree bark, everything. But what he eventually found was a piece of carbonized cardboard. When applied electric current in a vacuum, it had to be in a vacuum, so no air. What you do is run electricity through a piece of this carbonized, basically slightly burnt cardboard, and it would glow. And it glowed for hours. Now the cardboard doesn't last; it would eventually burn out, but it would glow for hours. And he realized he was onto something. Had to do with the carbon. Once again, I'm not a science teacher. I don't know all the details there, but he figured out that as long as he'd made a vacuum tube, so that's why light bulbs, especially the old incandescent light bulbs, when they break, you hear the shatter. It's because gas gets in there. As long as you maintain that vacuum tube, and you have a carbonized piece today, I think we use tungsten or titanium, something that's a little harder, but you have a piece of carbon in there. Essentially, you run electrical current through it, and it will glow, and it will give off a good amount of light. Well, why the vacuum? Fire needs three things, right? Fire needs fuel, it needs an ignition source, and it needs oxygen. So if he pumps all the air out of a light bulb, and that's what a light bulb is, a little vacuum, if you pump all the air out of there, you put in fuel, you put in that piece of carbon, whatever, that's going to be able to burn, or get hot rather. You put in a power source, electricity, that's the ignition, but you remove the air. It's not going to catch on fire, but it will get really hot. It's going to have a lot of energy, and that glows out there. That's the first light bulbs. Now, unfortunately, the first light bulbs also give out a massive amount of heat. It's kind of inefficient. They waste a lot of energy, waste a lot of electricity, turning it into the form of heat. Also, as soon as a little bit of air gets into a light bulb, you're going to hear a pop, and it's going to shatter and break, and that's why incandescent bulbs would break that way. They don't last for very long. But he does create light bulbs, and that's going to be a game changer, right? Because now all of a sudden you can have sports, and you can go to museums at night, and the street lights will be illuminated. He banishes the darkness. That's a huge change in human life. We can eventually, batteries too, right? You can have light anywhere. You can put it on a helmet, and then you can go into your coal mine and be able to see. If you wanted to, you could work in your job, get off your job, go to a sporting stadium. And if you've ever been to a sports stadium, even the ones here at Northview, you see the giant lights that illuminate the football field. You couldn't have football games, baseball games, soccer games at night for most of history, and most people weren't playing these games at 10 in the morning, because people had to work. And so now sports are going to be created, and people are going to be able to attend these. It's really hard to imagine a world without the light bulb, but it had a huge change on the way we live. He banishes the darkness. Great. He also creates record players, video cameras, all sorts of stuff, all kinds of technology. And the last one we need to talk about right now is the invention of steel. which once again you take for granted. It's all over. You're possibly sitting on something made out of steel. Right now, you probably have steel that's holding your jeans together in the rivets. You see steel everywhere. You don't have to look around for it. It might even be on the walls in your house. Steel is everywhere. But for most of human history, steel was a luxury item. In ancient civilizations, they could make steel in small quantities, and they would use it for designer swords, like the most expensive swords that you could ever imagine, like owning a Lamborghini, and also jewelry. Steel was used for jewelry, which, imagine your spouse bringing you steel jewelry. Today, you probably wouldn't be that happy, but for most of history, that was a rare luxury item. Why? Well, steel is basically refined iron. There's other things added in, they change the chemical structure, whatever. But steel is basically an improved form of iron. Iron by itself is quite heavy and it's kind of brittle, and that seems weird. But steel will bend, iron will break, it will shatter. If you took an cast iron pot or pan and you smashed it on concrete, it would shatter into a bunch of pieces. Where steel, if you did the same thing with a steel pan, it would dent. You might be able to hammer those dents out. The steel would maintain, its cohesion, whereas the iron would break apart. So iron's heavy, it's hard to work with, it's more limited. Steel was way better. But here's the problem. Steel was hard to make. For most of history, people would make steel in small quantities, and what they would do is take iron, usually very rough, raw forms of iron, get it incredibly hot, try to get as much of the impurities or much of the slag out as they possibly can, and melt it down, and eventually you'd get very small quantities of steel. You had to get to an incredibly high temperature, and you can only do this in very small amounts. Eventually, a guy, his name was Henry Bessemer in England, he creates this, what we call the Bessemer process, which allows us to mass produce steel. You melt down iron, can't change that, but you get this giant pot. It usually had, I believe it's clay brick lining, ceramic lining on the inside, and then it would be steel eventually, but iron originally on the outside of that to hold it all together. And you get this incredibly hot using new technologies and a lot of coal, and eventually refined coal called coke, which we talked about a little bit before during the Tang Song China dynasty chapters. But you get it incredibly hot by burning a massive amount of coal, get it super molten, I don't know the temperature, and then you blast boiling hot air through it as well too, basically steam. Blast that through. It's a dangerous and kind of explosive process, but Henry Bessemer, who was originally, I believe, a gunsmith or a bullet maker, he was some munitions maker, he figured out that this way you could mass produce steel and pour it out, and be left with nothing but steel that you could then pour out. That's a big one. That's nowadays, steel is everywhere. It's because of the Bessemer process. Of course, we've fixed and refined and made it more efficient, but the same idea is right here. So the Bessemer process allows for mass production of steel. Imagine your life without steel. Steel gave us skyscrapers, right? Before this, you couldn't build a house very high because if you were building out of wood, it would collapse under the weight. Steel's going to change all that. Steel's going to give us all sorts of things. Yeah, steel and then eventually aluminum as well too is going to give us our space program and flight. Steel is an amazing material. It's stronger, it's lighter, it's easier to work with. It's just better in every possible imaginable way. Henry Bessemer comes up with the Bessemer process. He sells the idea to an American, Scottish immigrant to America, but he sells the idea to an American businessman named Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is going to create U.S. Steel. Carnegie Steel, U.S. Steel, and that steel producing plant in steel production in America will be gangbusters. Its steel is going to give us the railroads and build trains and skyscrapers and basically go all across America. And America is going to be an early leader in steel production. Andrew Carnegie, taking Henry Bessemer's idea, Andrew Carnegie will go on to be the third richest man to ever live on Earth. That's how common steel will be done and steel will be used. Mass production of steel now. So it's a game-changing moment.